there must have been some nurturing of beliefs that challenged the societal norms of the 1560s. From where did the idea of freedom of thought emerge? That question is really important to me because I still see forces within many cultures, including our own, that seek to polarize religions and peoples rather than to find places where tolerance and, more importantly, pluralism can thrive in a world community. And I just want to do an aside here because as I was working on my sermon, I really struggle with the word tolerance. I don't want to be tolerated, and I don't think anybody else does. But we've got to find better language. So when I use the word tolerance in my sermon, think of it as bigger than, I didn't have time to think of a better word, but pluralism works. And I think people like Eboo Patel with the Interfaith Youth Corps and other projects, people are really talking much more about pluralism. In many ways, it makes sense that a statement of religious tolerance emerged in this tiny kingdom of Transylvania. Remember, it's on the western side of Hungary because originally it was part of Hungary, but now it's part of Romania. And that area was really at the crossroads of the land route between East and West, with trade between Turkey and the Middle East coming through to Western Europe. Now, that still happens, I know, because I was on a mountainous two-lane road in a van, and we went around a curve, and here's a big tractor-trailer truck from Turkey coming through, and a Roma wagon right in front of us, and we were all screaming, saying, "We're going to die, never get back." But anyway, so, it's still a land route. Such travel and trade certainly brought knowledge and wisdom from all the cultures that passed through that area of the world. In addition, as the trade was coming through, people met, married, and decided to stay in this beautiful land. I imagine that the rich universalism of Islamic Sufism and Jewish humanism reached the hearts and minds of our Unitarian forebears. Were these exchanges part of the rich heritage from which our beliefs emerged? In the past few years, I've learned that other Unitarian Universalists have been asking similar questions. After some searching, I finally connected with the Reverend Dr. Susan Ritchie, who now teaches at our Star King School for the Ministry in California. And if you want to go online, her 6 men's lectures show what has come to light in her research on our Unitarian connections to Islam and Judaism. So this morning I just want to skim the surface of our Unitarian connections to Islam that she's unearthed. Our roots in Judaism also need to be explored, but that's going to have to be another Sunday. It was affirming to realize that the very foundation of our faith is interwoven with Islam and Judaism. Sadly, much of the dynamic interchange among the religions has been edited out of history. And I'm grateful to Dr. Ritchie and others who are finally documenting some of those historic connections. And if we go back before the 16th century, of course we know that the Emperor Constantine decided to make Christianity his state religion in the 4th century. And he pushed early church leaders to declare a unified religion and cut ties with all the dissenting threads of Christian theology and belief. Our 2 threads of Unitarian and Universalism were part of that. Many sects of early Christians, like us, believed in the unity of God, saw Jesus as a Jewish prophet and proclaimed universal salvation. All these beliefs, as we know, were repressed by persecution and death, and that didn't stop in the 4th century. Still, over the centuries, the belief in the unity of God just continued to emerge in different cultures as a theological tenet, especially for liberal theologians. But as the power of orthodoxy within the Christian church grew, there was less and less toleration for those whose beliefs were not in doctrinal compliance. And yet, from the 8th through the mid-15th centuries, one bright spot of intellectual and theological exploration, as well as religious tolerance, was the reign of Islamic influence in Andalusia, Al-Andalus. It was an Islamic kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. Liberal religious thinkers flourished in the dynamic interchange among religions until the expulsion of the Moors by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. We never learned that history. We only learn about Columbus. Though the centuries of this kingdom included wars and pressure from Christian incursions, this period of history saw Andalusia as a place where intellectual and theological exploration flourished. There was respect for the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who it was believed were all children of Abraham and believers in one God. These centuries of religious tolerance provided the opportunity for theological and cultural exchange as faiths learned from and with each other. So then, with the expulsion of the Muslim Moors from Spain in 1492, there began a long siege of oppression by the church for those who didn't express a belief in Christian orthodoxy. Jews who before had freely explored their faith were either forced out of the country, forced to convert to Christianity, or sentenced to torture and death by the Inquisition. Liberal religious thinkers fled to other parts of Europe where toleration and freedom of thought continued to thrive in some areas. Our own forebear, the Spaniard Michael Servetus, who was eventually burned at the stake by John Calvin, was one of those liberal thinkers whose heretical writings on the errors of the Trinity targeted him for persecution. Many of these liberal non-Trinitarian theologians, such as Servetus, had to travel from place to place, seeking a safe harbor to think and to write. Many of them eventually found protection from persecution in the Ottoman Empire, whose borders then included what is now Romania and parts of Hungary. The philosophy of the Ottoman Empire, which we don't hear much about, was in harmony with the teachings of Muhammad, who believed that Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all part of the family of Abraham, who believed in the same one God. The Ottomans, therefore, welcomed liberal Christians and Jews into the kingdom as brothers and sisters. We know that during this time, the courts in the Ottoman kingdom were sought out by Christians from various parts of Western Europe because their rulings were thought to be more kind and just than many of the decrees by judges in Christian-ruled nations. So into this wise and open governance came early discussions of religious tolerance. The Sultan Suleiman of the Ottoman Empire was a friend of the King of Hungary, John Sigismund's father. When the king died, the Sultan promised to protect his infant son. He gave the small kingdom of Transylvania, which was under the protection of the Ottomans, to the king's infant son John, and appointed John's mother Isabella as a regent. Queen Isabella was formidable in her own right. She had grown up in a very learned, liberal Polish court and was a dedicated humanist. Under the protection of the Ottoman Empire, John, who would become the only Unitarian king in history, grew to manhood in an environment in which families from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faiths intermarried and lived peacefully in shared communities. Much of the history of the ways the Ottomans supported independent governance of Hungary and Transylvania has been edited out of history, in part because of the historic animosity between Turkey and Hungary. Yet without the political protection of the Ottoman Empire during those formative years, the Counter-Reformation and the Protestant movements, such as Unitarianism, could not have developed and matured. This protection was possible because of the Ottoman Empire's philosophy of including and synthesizing cultural elements of the lands through which they passed. Religious and cultural toleration was, in part, let's be realistic, a matter of bureaucratic expediency. So in 1568, into this rich religious milieu, influenced by other liberal religious thinkers, came our forebear Francis David, court preacher to the young king, John Sigismund, who preached, "There have always been many opinions about faith." And he said, "Ege az ishtin," God is one. David himself was familiar with the toleration of other faiths within the Ottoman Empire, probably including an earlier Ottoman edict in 1548, pronouncing the importance of free thinking and speaking. David was also friends with other free thinkers who had written treatises on religious tolerance. So finally, here are the interwoven threads that led to the first true edict of religious tolerance signed by King Sigismund. As much as our historians would like to see this edict as a purely Unitarian gift to the world, it did not emerge out of thin air. It emerged from the rich and diverse evolution of thought that had been nurtured within this protected environment of the Ottoman Empire. Threads of thought that have been woven from Spain and Turkey, from Jerusalem and Prague, all merged at a particular time in history when freedom of thought was tolerated. From Michael Servetus in Spain to Socinus in Italy to Ibn Arabi in Turkey and Jewish scholars in Europe and Jerusalem, insights and wisdom evolved and were reshaped until a Unitarian king honed an edict of tolerance that would help shape the history of our faith. This is an amazing tradition that needs to be reclaimed. Dr. Ritchie writes, continental European Unitarianism was formed in large part by the desire to honor Christianity's close kinship with Judaism and Islam. Convinced that Christians, Muslims, and Jews were part of the same religious family, Unitarians emerged as those liberal Christians who resisted theologies of God that could not be freely shared across traditions. Sadly, over the centuries, and certainly in the last decade, we've forgotten how our faiths learned together and influenced one another. I believe it's time to reclaim that lesson from our history, Today, we live in a time when it's too easy to forget the gifts of Islam. Therefore, we need to remember and offer gratitude for the Islamic wisdom that helped influence the founding of our faith. We have forgotten that during earlier parts of our history, some of the most radical Unitarian literature was published in Turkey and then smuggled into Transylvania and other parts of Europe. In part, we've lost our history because Hungarian nationalism sought to edit out of its history Hungary's dependence on the Ottoman Empire and the gifts that kingdom brought to the region. Sadly, during the reign of the Ottomans, much like today, Europeans feared that the Ottoman Empire would extend to dominate Western Europe. This fear, like much fear we see today, gave birth to many forms of Islamophobia which still plague us. So why did we lose this connection? Part of it has to do with our own history of Unitarian thought in this country, which was influenced by some elitists we call the Boston Brahmin, who felt uncomfortable with people of different ethnicities, people of different faiths, people of different classes. But it was with the emergence of the Transcendentalists in the mid-19th century that an interest in interfaith dialogue and the intellectual milieu from other religious traditions that we've begun to get reconnected. The discourse of Transcendentalists such as Emerson, Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller moved away from that, dare I say, sort of snobbish nature that sometimes took place in Boston to be more inclusive because they wanted a stronger connection with other faiths, particularly Sufi teachings and other Eastern spiritual teachings, which had a belief in intuition and mysticism. We often today forget that part of our history. Believing that all spiritual thought emerged from one source, many of the Transcendentalists appropriated beliefs of Sufism and other spiritual traditions of the East. In this way, those spiritual traditions began to re-enter Unitarian thinking in a subtle and indistinct way. In our day, when people have difficulty honoring the positive aspects of Islam, it's important for us to look at the threads of our history that have been shaped by Islam. There's so much misinformation and so much so much racial and religious profiling going on around the country that we need to learn more about Islam so that we can respond to some of the prejudice that's rampant in our society. I think that our path, that our future as a faith, as a nation, and as a world depends on human beings remembering those places in history when human beings were able to live in harmony and when they explored faiths and cultures that were different than their own with curiosity rather than prejudice. We need to remember the times when human society honored new intellectual and social explorations as the means of enhancing society rather than being threatened by change in those people whose beliefs were different than our own. We can see that there have been glimpses of the world, of what the world would have been like if toleration had continued to thrive in that time when Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in harmony on the Iberian Peninsula, and how the protection of diversity of thought in Eastern Europe nurtured religious diversity, including the emergence of Unitarianism in Transylvania. Our task as people of goodwill is to remember what is possible and to work to build structures in this community and the world where an affirmation of a free and pluralistic society can once again exist. I invite us to rise in body or spirit